Welcome. This is an Interpreter Roundtable. Today we're covering Book of Mormon, Gospel Doctrine, Lesson 27, which covers Alma chapters 30 and 31. So this is exciting. We get to talk about Korihor and all kinds of other fun things today.
What could be better?
What could be better? Joining us on the roundtable today, we have Bruce Webster. We have Daniel Peterson, Stephen Smoot. I'm Martin Tanner. I'll be moderating. And to start us off tonight, Stephen is going to give us some background information about these chapters. You're up.
All right, awesome. So, okay, Alma 30 and 31. This comes right after the narrative about the anti-Nephi Lehis settling in the land of Jerishon. The anti-Nephi Lehis are otherwise known as the Ammonites, since Ammon was one who converted them. These are former Lamanites who become essentially Nephites. They're identified as Nephites, and they're given the land Jerishon, which is the land of Jerishon acts as sort of a buffering zone between the land of Zarahemla that the Nephites are inhabiting and the land of Nephi that the Lamanites are inhabiting. And it's meant to sort of act as this buffer zone between the two. And so they put them there, they keep an eye on them, and they have that all sort of settled. And then right as soon as that happens, and just as soon as they think everything is great again, right, they repelled some Lamanite attacks, and they've settled the anti-Nephi Lehis, and then Korihor comes along. So they just go from one problem to another. They can't catch a break. If it's not spiritual, or rather if it's not military and political problems, it's spiritual heresies and apostasy that they have to deal with. So this is rather precarious for the Nephites. So Korihor comes in Alma 30, and it says in verse 6, there came a man into the land of Zarahemla, which would seem to imply that Korihor is not a Nephite, that he's not already in the land of Nephi because he comes into it. But we don't know much more about his background besides that. I don't think it ever specifies exactly where he comes from, other than he's probably not a Nephite, or he may be a Nephite, but he's not from the land of Zarahemla. So we just don't know much about Korihor's backstory there. So he's going to come in, and we'll have a big long discussion about what he talks about and why he's significant. But what's interesting is that once the Korihor issue is settled, Alma is still not done yet, because again, skipping from one problem to another. First it's Korihor, and then in Alma 31, Alma has to go to the Zoramites in the land of Antionum, which is east of the land of Zarahemla. And this is where we'll talk about the Ramyumptom and all that wonderful stuff that the Zoramites are doing there. And, these poor Zoramites, they just get kicked around all the time. They just, kind of like Alma, they just can't catch a break, right? Either they're being despised because they're poor, they're being pushed around because they're weak politically and militarily. The poor Zoramites just can't catch a break. And on top of all of that, now we have this big wave of apostasy happening amongst the Zoramites. And this apostasy and Alma's attempt to sort of intervene and stop this is going to eventually fracture the Zoramites, and the large portion of them are going to end up aligning with the Lamanites. And so when you get in the war chapters in Alma 40, I think it starts in 44 or 45, once you get in there, by that time a good chunk of the Zoramites, the ones that Alma had tried to save, they've ended up joining with the Lamanites. And only a small portion, presumably the poor that Alma was preaching to, are the ones who stick with the righteous Nephites. So that's kind of setting up what we're doing here. I think the overall point of what's happening here is that the Nephites are constantly facing different crises. Political crises, military crises, spiritual or doctrinal crises, and this is all going to sort of foment, and all these different players are going to, and all these different factors are going to foment until we have the war chapters. It all just sort of spills over in mid-Alma with the war chapters. And that's for another time. But that's kind of an idea of what's happening here to get some situated context for what's going on in the narrative.
If I might just toss in one thing, there might be one possible clue to Korihor's background in the fact that that name occurs spelled differently in the Standard Edition, with a C instead of a K, twice as a Jaredite.
Jaredite, yeah.
And so you always wonder, are these people who are dissidents, do they have some sort of ethnic difference? Is there something else that's going on behind the scenes? And that name may point to it.
Well, it's interesting because Sherem is another apparent outsider who has a different ethnic background from the Nephites, right? You can read that in Jacob 7 where he comes into the people of Nephi and he says, well, I've learned your language and so I can talk with you and all this stuff. So, yeah, it wouldn't be surprising at all if Korihor is also coming from a different ethnic backdrop, possibly Jaredite. Yeah.
It could be a population, for example, that felt displaced and maybe under the thumb of latecomers, usurpers, something like that. There's some sort of resentment that plays a role. But that's amateur psychoanalysis based on very little. It's just speculation.
Right.
Last week in Gospel Doctrine class, I asked people what they thought it meant when the Book of Mormon refers to a Nephite and to a Lamanite. And the instant reaction was, well, people who are descended from Nephi, who were favorable to the church, people who had something to do with Lehi and his party. But it's very clear from some of the chapters that not too many years after they reach this new land, that this is no longer just an ethnic designation. There's a lot more going on here. It would be a little bit like trying to divide up the United States into Mormons or non-Mormons, or into Republicans and Democrats, or into two other groups. It's just far more complicated than a simplistic solution here, and yet the Book of Mormon does that because it's not pertinent to the storyline when you get right down to it. The importance of what's going on here is Korihor and what he's saying. One of the other quick comments that I'd like to make about Korihor is that in chapters 9, 10, and 11, it talks about how a person's acts, the way someone conducts their life, is subject to the laws. If you murder, you're punished. If you do other things, adultery and so on, you're punished. But there is, well, verse 11, nevertheless, there was no law against a man's belief. And one might think, well, that's only obvious. And yet there are so many ways that you can curtail what someone says. During our last roundtable, Bruce brought up the fact that Putin's Russia is no longer such a friendly place for the Mormon missionaries because they can no longer actively teach except apparently inside LDS chapels. No more door-to-door, nothing like that. And there are other similar kinds of laws, particularly in the Middle East, but in other places as well. So it would be possible to stop the kinds of activities that Korihor did with the law, but that doesn't quite happen here. It's an open society, and open societies only work well when people have good moral values, as the Founding Fathers say.
That raises an interesting issue, because it says that there's no law against a man's belief, but he's punished for crimes. But Korihor is, in fact, arrested twice for preaching. He's thrown out of the land of the Ammonites, and he's thrown out again. He's brought to the chief judge. I noticed that the chief judge actually doesn't exercise legal authority on him. The interaction is more ecclesiastical, and there's no legal punishment that's attached to him after he's turned dumb rather, by divine action. He's simply let go. He's not imprisoned or punished. So I've wondered if maybe some of the people that arrested him were a little overzealous, just got sick of him. But when it comes to the chief judge, he actually does not use legal punishment against him.
Well, actually,
what's also interesting. Oh, go ahead, Bruce.
I was just going to say, in the Ammonites, it says they were more wise. They basically show him the border.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, you're free to preach, but you're free to preach somewhere else.
Yeah.
We don't want you around here.
Yeah.
It's sort of expelled as an undesirable. Something, of course, LDS missionaries have suffered it from time to time over the last
Yeah.
160 years. But
You can do things short of legal punishment that still, do the job. We used to be harassed all the time by people who were checking into our foreigner pass that we were supposed to carry with us. We always had it. I mean, but it could be a nuisance. So anyway, people complained, didn't want us there. So anyway, didn't mean to go off on that sidetrack, but.
Well, I actually think that's kind of important to note, is the legal backdrop to all of this. And John Welch has done some pretty great work situating the legal context for these trials. The other example that comes up is Nehor, and they face the same problem here, and this is a quote from Welch. Did equality mean that a person could not only believe whatever he wanted, but also say whatever he wanted? If a person did not believe that Jehovah was God, could he be punished for profaning the name of Jehovah or speaking insolently against him? In other words, did freedom of belief or disbelief entail freedom of expression specifically articulating or reflecting that belief? This important question had been neither contemplated nor addressed in the law originally established by King Mosiah a generation earlier. So this is the same problem we had with Nehor. This is the same problem that pops up again and again and we even see it in today's society, right? In today's culture, we have this question: at what point does freedom of speech, does freedom of belief and religion, at what point does that cross over into illegal action or objectionable action, right? And the Nephites wrestled with this same question, and Alma grappled with the same question with Nehor and then with Korihor. And the reason for that simply being is in the ancient world, there was no real distinction between church and state. There was, there's no, this nice dichotomy we have today where you sort of compartmentalize what you believe versus how you behave as a citizen. That was all wrapped up as one thing in the ancient world, and almost every ancient society I can think of, right? What you believed, what God you affirmed, how you affirmed belief in that God, what sort of rights you participated in, this was directly connected with the social and judicial fabric of society. So by breaking that, it's a lot more than just you have a personal belief. In a lot of people's eyes, it's you're treasonous in some way. So these are the issues that they grapple with, including with Korihor.
Well, we make that distinction really in the church in a way, and so this may have been a society more akin to the church than to our secularized United States today, our secularized Western European countries or whatever. In the church, we'll often tell you, and we really mean it, that the bishop won't come after you for believing X, Y, or Z. You might not get a temple recommend, but you're not going to be driven out of the church simply because you believe or disbelieve something. But you also will be asked not to preach it in church. And if you do start proselytizing for a point of view that's out of harmony with the church, if that's in a serious way, then you might well be shown the door. Where if you just stayed quietly at home and say, I don't believe in the Book of Mormon, or I don't believe in God, the church isn't going to come after you. But if you go into sacrament meeting and preach that from the pulpit, or raise it even as a class member in a class, very often you'll be asked to not do so. You'll be asked to leave. You might be thrown out. So we do make a distinction between, it seems to me, between private belief, where we enjoy complete freedom, and expression within the church.
That is very true. There is even some degree of dissent, dissent's not the right word, of unusual beliefs that can be mentioned within the church. There's this great, at least I like it a lot, a great little excerpt from history about Pelatiah Brown in the history of the church. He's teaching in the early days of the church. This is in Kirtland, and he's teaching some kind of odd doctrine about the book of Revelation. And so he's asked to stop, apparently by his ecclesiastical leaders, and he won't. And so he's hauled up before the High Council in Kirtland, and they censure him. And so he appeals to Joseph Smith, and Joseph Smith's comments, and of course this is a paraphrase, I don't have it in front of me right now, but Joseph Smith says, I don't like the idea of creeds and telling someone what they have to believe. It sounds too much like some of the other denominations that have long lists of what you must believe. And so the idea in our church is that you can believe a lot. You might even be able to express those opinions, but if you start criticizing the brethren openly or in the church or teaching tremendously odd things, then you're really in trouble.
Right.
Other comments about Korihor that I find fascinating is that, and maybe this is the same in every generation, but as you read through, starting in verse 12 of chapter 30, of the things that he teaches, no one can know what's going to happen in the future. All these ideas about what's going to happen, this is a bunch of nonsense. You can't know of things that you don't see. The whole idea of religion is, quote, the effect of a frenzied mind. You know, there are all these great little quotes in here. And verse 18, when a man was dead, that was the end thereof. You know, these are the same kinds of things that you hear from atheists and agnostics and many other people from all kinds of different backgrounds today. It's the whole idea that, and frankly, there's an arrogance to it. It's that if you can't experience it, and if you haven't experienced it, it can't be real. If somebody else has a vision, oh, that can't be real. I haven't had one. That's implicit behind all of these things, and you sense this arrogance to the arguments of Korihor, in contrast to the humility of the members of the church, the true believers who are here, who are looking forward to Christ and very much exercising their faith about things which are to come in the future.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things that strikes me about Korihor every time I read this is how contemporary he sounds, right down to the derangement of your minds. I mean, Freud said famously that religion was a kind of collective neurosis. It was a mental illness, and so you're not just wrong; you're mentally ill if you believe. And I hear that all the time still today, that people who believe are irrational, they're basically out of touch with reality. And you don't have to have any empirical proof for that. You just assert it. It's self-evident to those who hold that view. But
that is
that's
true.
Korihor's position. Yeah.
Professor Bergen at BYU did a lot to change that just 20 or 30 years ago. It was still believed by most of the psychological community that those who believed really had a mental illness or a mental problem. And then Columbia professor, more recently, actually I think he's emeritus now, but he taught at BYU for quite some period of time. Professor Bergen did a lot of studies that showed that people who are active in a religious faith are more happy, more well-adjusted, more normal, and all the real senses of that statement that really means something. And so this idea that religion is aberrant has been shown to be false, but it still rears its ugly head.
There was, in fact, a book, and I was just going to look for the author's name, but it's not that important. But there's a seminar taught by a fellow at Harvard Medical School, who's a psychiatrist there, who has taught for years an honors seminar for undergraduates on C.S. Lewis and Sigmund Freud. And he's comparing their lives and which one had the better life, the more satisfying life, which one was actually more sane and healthy. And I remember picking that up and thinking, oh, well, this will be probably another anti-religious diatribe out of Harvard Medical School or something. As a matter of fact, he concludes overwhelmingly that C.S. Lewis was the healthier of the two, psychologically and in every other way, and that Freud was a mess. So Freud is pointing the finger at religious believers, and it's not as simplistic as that, but it was a really interesting study. The one a religious apologist and the other an anti-religious apologist, if you will, who claimed that by definition the other guy would be mentally ill, and it doesn't hold up. So
one thing, if I could comment, going along with this discussion, this theme here. I certainly think that the modern parallels with Korihor are absolutely apparent in today's discourse. But one thing that struck me is, people are really quick to call Korihor an atheist, right? Since his philosophy aligns very closely with a lot of modern atheism. But I think there's some key ways that Korihor sort of defies expectation in this regard. For one thing, I don't know too many modern atheists that affirm the existence of Satan, right? Which Korihor explicitly does at the end of all of this, right? So what's interesting to me is when I was at BYU, I took a class on Near Eastern and Mediterranean history from the classical era onward, right, the Hellenistic era onward, and we looked pretty closely at Greek philosophy during the Hellenistic period. And when we learned about Epicurus and Epicureanism, it really struck me how many parallels there were between sort of the Epicurean philosophy and what Korihor was into. And there are very obvious differences, but if there were any atheists in the ancient world, the Epicureans were probably the closest coming to that, in the sense that, and this is what I think Korihor is getting at, the Epicureans, they denied that the gods had operative power in the lives of mortals and everyday life. The gods were there, right? They never explicitly disavowed the existence of the gods per se, but the gods just don't get involved in human affairs, right? And so our job is to use reason and to pursue the pleasures of life, and they get into this very humanistic ethic that gets carried up today. But this reminds me of what we have in verse 17 when it says, so Korihor says there will be no atonement made for sins of man, but every man fared in this life according to the management of the creature. Therefore every man prospered according to his genius, and every man conquered according to his strength. Okay, so I think what we have with Korihor here is more of a sort of a functional atheism, sort of a moral atheism, right? It's denying that God in any way gets involved in moral action in the world, in individual human affairs. And so what is moral and immoral, what is right and wrong, how we are supposed to prosper in our lives, it's entirely up to us and our own genius, okay? So I don't know, some interesting nuance there, I think, that we sometimes look over when we want to just sort of put Korihor in the modern atheism camp. I think it's pretty striking to see that there were both ancient and modern undercurrents of these thoughts that Korihor sort of picks up on, or that he definitely has parallels with.
There's another parallel. Oh, sorry, Bruce. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, to follow up on that, because I was an atheist once myself, at age 9, seriously, for 4 years. But to follow up on that, the telling point there is the last phrase there in verse 17. Whatsoever a man did was no crime. Will be echoed about 50 years later in Brothers Karamazov. If there is no afterlife, all things are lawful. But the interesting thing is that the discussions and occasional arguments I've had with atheist friends is that they very much feel there is a right and wrong and they can define it. And the question I had, my question back is based on what? What is your morality? And of course they say, well, here are first principles, and we reason from that. And the answer comes back, well, what if someone reasons differently? What is your standing to say I'm right and they're wrong? Since you're both arguing from your own set of first principles. In some respects, I consider Korihor more intellectually honest in what he's saying. In saying, well, it's dog eat dog. It's based on the talents and strengths we have, and it really doesn't matter what you do. Or at least it's no crime what you do. Which and of course he attracts followers who are very enticed by this, and the crimes are not cast in any terms in terms of murder or robbery or so on. They're sexual crimes, apparently violations of what were considered norms within Nephite society at that time that he's luring them on. So it's it's like I said, he's in some respects he takes the argument further than most of my modern atheist friends are willing to.
I think that's a really important point because, it comes down to the question of whether morality is something that is in some sense out there, objectively existing. That is, whether I believe in kindness or not, kindness is good. There's something objectively wrong on that view with, say, torturing puppies for the heck of it, or or torturing small children for fun. I mean, it was just a normally functioning human being should know somehow that that is wrong. It's not merely a matter of taste, like you like broccoli, I don't, but we can't argue about that. You don't argue about, well, broccoli tastes good. The proper answer to that is, well, to me it doesn't, and that's it. That's all you can say. Say, well, kindness is good. If someone else says, no, I don't think kindness is good. Well, what can you say if we'd normally regard that as you're just dysfunctional? If you really don't believe kindness is good, we might disagree about specific instances, but if you really think kindness is not good, or honesty is not a good thing, or killing puppies for fun is okay, then we'd usually say there's something wrong with you. But we don't say that more than jokingly about broccoli, or I like chocolate and you don't, or something like that. There we understand, tastes differ, but on morality, we just don't behave that way. And if the Nazis had come back, as they could well have done, and said, look, our morality is not grounded like yours. We really do believe that the basis of morality is advancing the Aryan race. And so, killing Jews is a good thing. Creating living space for us is a good thing. The Allies don't say, oh, well, I guess, well, yeah, okay, different strokes for different folks. You're okay. Follow your bliss. They don't say that. They say you're wrong and we're going to punish you. One thing I wanted to point out, if I can, before we let this go, I think the ending of chapter 30 is really, really interesting in view of what I see as almost a foreshadowing of social Darwinism here in verse 17, that every man fared in this life according to the management of the creature, every man prospered according to his genius, every man conquered according to his strength. And then look at the end. What happens to Korihor? Yeah. He's cast out. He can't speak. And he ends up being run over in a society where he's not strong. He's not, the master of the universe. He's just a weak beggar out there, and he gets run over by a carriage and killed. I mean, that's that's among the Zoramites, which will lead into, of course, the next chapter. But you couldn't have, in some ways, a more poetically appropriate ending for someone who claims it's all about survival of the fittest. Whoever's tough, that guy wins, and let the poor and the weak fend for themselves. And in the end, he's run over and killed because he's weak. It's the irony is so thick you can cut it with a knife.
And the irony functions on a number of levels. That's a really great example, Dan, of irony in this narrative. Another perfect example of irony is Korihor's punishment. The fact that he's struck dumb and unable to speak. This whole time, what has he been doing? He's been blaspheming God, right? And he's been preaching and flattering people, and it's all a very verbal sort of action that's happening here, right? And so he's struck dumb and he can't speak, and he says, well, okay, I admit I was wrong, so please take this curse away from me. And Alma says, well, God's not going to lift the curse for you because he knows if you do, you'll just go right back to preaching, right? You'll back to blaspheming. So yes, it's ironic too what his punishment is, right? It's almost out of Dante or something, right? Like he was verbally blaspheming God, so he's struck dumb. So I think this is a very sophisticated text on that level, right? The way that this is being crafted and presented, it's very sophisticated with really rich irony going on here on many levels.
Mm-hmm.
Let me jump in and make one other observation, which isn't mine. It's really Nibley's. I think back since Gomorrah. One of the fascinating things about the Book of Mormon is that it is a manual on ways of disbelief. From the very start, with the Jews who reject Lehi and with the rebellion of Laman and Lemuel, we have example after example of ways to disbelieve in God and disbelieve in Christ. And we see these confrontations. And one of the points Nibley makes is that the Book of Mormon allows them to make their arguments. I mean, you've got Korihor here laying out, which, we look at this, we say, this is like, I have friends on Facebook who post stuff that sounds like Korihor. But they're allowed to make their arguments. It's not, oh, this person was evil and we killed him. We have the confrontations. We have, the preaching of Sherem, of Nehor, of Korihor here. We're going to see the in the wars, we're going to see the letters back and forth between the Lamanite leaders, who are actually apostate Nephites, and Moroni. We're going to see it again with the Gadianton robbers. They are allowed to make their arguments. Now, the text shows what happens as a consequence and so on, but it doesn't. It shows so many different ways in which we distance ourselves from God and the beliefs that lead us there. You know, with Nehor, it's everyone's saved, doesn't matter what you do. With Korihor, it's nobody's saved, nothing happens after we die, it doesn't matter what you do. You know, and then you've got variations on, well, this is how we worship. You know, we're going to see in chapter 31. It's like, we're grateful you have saved us and you've sent everyone else to hell. You know, a little foreshadowing here for the next chapter, but we have this time and again in the Book of Mormon, and I think that was a very deliberate effort. I mean, some of that shows up in the original Small Plates of Nephi, but I think it was a very deliberate effort on the part of Mormon to continue to give the voice to these various ways of non-belief, specifically to caution us and to show what the consequences and where things lead to when you follow it.
Yeah.
One final comment for me on chapter 30, and that is that I once had someone come to me and say, you know, I can't believe the Book of Mormon. And one of the examples was this Korihor guy. There's no way you can convince me that, for example, in verse 43, he's denying the existence of God unless he's shown a sign. He's denying Christ, he's denying God, and then as Stephen pointed out earlier, a devil deceived him in verse 53 and appeared to him in the form of an angel. You say, well, wait a minute, how is this possible? How can somebody claim to not believe in God, but claim that an angel came to him? These kinds of things happen all the time. I remember there were a group of kids in junior high that I went skiing with all the time, and I loved to ski with them. They were highly irreligious. They just didn't believe in God. They didn't believe in anything. And I remember when the Exorcist movie came out. Oh, that, you know, of course, I did not go see that, but they all did, and they were scared to death. And I asked them why, and they said, well, there's all these evil things and evil spirits and demonic possessions. I said, so let me get this right. You believe in the devil? Oh yeah, there's all these horrible evil things, but not in God. No, I don't believe in God at all. And there really are people like that. This Korihor is not an anomaly. There are lots of people who have that kind of belief, and frankly, many of them are secularists today. They're afraid of evil and evil spirits and evil things, but they would deny the existence of God. This is not uncommon. Any other comments about chapter 31?
There's a line attributed to G.K. Chesterton. I don't know if it's authentic or not. There's some arguments about that, but he's supposed to have said something like, when you don't believe in God, it isn't that you don't believe anything. It's you'll believe almost anything. I think he was talking about that kind of thing, that he knew people who weren't Christians. They rejected God, but they were into spiritualism and all sorts of occultic things. It's very odd. At first you don't imagine that could happen, but it does. You're right, it does.
Very much does.
Well, I do know that recent surveys have shown that something along the order of 20% of professed atheists still believe in ghosts, for example, or supernatural entities of some kind. So yeah, it's not at all uncommon.
Well, looks like Dan is back. This is a good thing. Any more comments about chapter 30? Let's move on to chapter 31 and hope we can get Dan back as we go. chapter 31 is a fascinating chapter. It in essence talks about a different kind of threat to the genuine faith. This time, it's the Ramyumptom, the holy stand. Anyone like to jump in and give the background for this? This is a great chapter. I have a few comments about tying the Ramyumptom in with the way different people believe or profess to believe today. But
let me give one tip here. One of the things that struck me some time ago rereading this chapter is that you pretty much have the Nephite Olympic missionary team here. It's not Alma going off by himself. Look who's going. You've got Alma going with Ammon, Aaron, and Omner, 3 of the 4 sons of Mosiah. Himni he leaves in charge of the church. He also takes Amulek and Zeezrom, and he also takes his sons Shiblon and Korihor. This is a full court press, missionary-wise. He's taking this very seriously. He sees it as both a religious and particularly a political issue, that this could really upset the balance of power, because the Zoramites are sitting there between the land of Jerushan and the Lamanites, and so it's sort of a pivot point. If they align with the Lamanites, then suddenly the Lamanites are right up against the Nephite borders. And so it's not him going off as he did before, early at the start of the book of Alma, where he's off preaching by himself, place to place. He takes, a total of 7 people? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 plus himself, 8 people in all. So it's a major effort on his part, and this is to one city, or at least one city and its environs. So it's a very serious. He's taking it very seriously as to what's going on here. Anyway, so that's the interesting tee-up in as far as seeing the Zoramites were dissenter. They had fallen into great errors, and then we learn about the Ramyumptom and their worship, and I'll toss that to someone else.
anyone else want to jump in on chapter 31? I've got a couple of quick comments here. One of the things that has always struck me about the Ramyumptom is the essential misuse of religion that it represents. It's a case of taking something that should be focused on God and going through the motions and turning it into something that is self-centered.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, that's how the law of Moses is portrayed by the Christians. It changed from a law where people genuinely worship God, or at least for the most part, and became something where people focused on the details so much that they were no longer focused on God. And there are so many things that can do that in religious faith, and this Ramyumptom does that eloquently as an example of all of those kinds of things, where it has people in arrogance, and this could be the same kind of thing as wearing fancy clothes to church, or focusing in on other things that are of this world rather than God. Anything that is religiously based that is distorted enough so that the focus no longer is on God or genuine good works can be represented by this Ramyumptom.
You know, maybe I could take that thought in a direction maybe you didn't have in mind, but I've been having a conversation just today with a fellow who's unhappy with the idea of God as taught by the LDS Church, for example, and I don't know if he's a theist otherwise, but there are certain things that God has said or done that he does not approve of, and it just occurred to me. I said to him, "Look, if God always did and spoke and thought and acted the way you think appropriate, then it would seem that he's redundant, and frankly, I'd be a little suspicious that you just made him up." Occasionally, God probably ought to surprise you just a little bit. He ought not to think exactly the way you do. His values ought not to be exactly the values of a person of your time, place, socioeconomic, and educational status. And it occurs to me sometimes that if you get right down to it, the fundamental thing that makes a person religious as opposed to a person who isn't, and really religious, I mean, is this sense that there is someone out there, or maybe even something in some religions, that is bigger, wiser, smarter, more powerful, better than you are. And there's a sort of a humility that says, you know, his ways are not my ways always, and I just have to take it on faith that what he's asking me to do is right. But if I'm the measure of all things, then I am my own God. You know, making God in our own image, and that's clearly what they've done. God becomes an instrument for them to congratulate themselves on how good they are.
That is so true. A good friend of mine, Van Hale, years ago told me when I was trying to just twist a verse in the New Testament to try to make it read the way I hoped it would. He said, you know, Martin, maybe it would do you some good if you just had an open mind and just read this book from the start to the finish and just let it speak to you rather than trying to impose your thoughts on it. And I thought that was really good advice. And Dan, you're just so right on the mark there. If anyone eventually passes away, and at the end of their life, as they go on to the next one and learn new things, if they aren't surprised and learn things that are a little bit different and see things that are a bit different from what they had expected and anticipated, if that doesn't happen, wow, you have things figured out a whole lot better than I do. That's all I can say. I expect to be surprised a great deal. Go ahead.
I was going to say, echoing both your comments, one of my favorite verses in all the Book of Mormon is Mosiah, chapter 4, verse 9, which says, you know, believe in God, believe that He is, and that He created all things both in heaven and earth. Believe that He has all wisdom and all power both in heaven and earth. Believe that man doth not comprehend all the things which the Lord can comprehend. And very much echoing, I think your comments, Dan, is there is this tendency that we want to put God in a box. It's kind of like, oh, this is if God's real, this is how I think He should be. And you know, there's an argument to be made for that to a certain extent. You know, I believe God is just. I believe it's loving. We often make that argument in terms of, say, the Mormon plan of salvation versus Calvinism. You know, but that said, I think Orson Scott Card once quipped that Mormons are the only people who believe the difference between them and God is a few years of training. I think we are guilty of that at times, of thinking, well, you know, God's an exalted man, I'm a man, hey, you know, I'm going to go to the next life and we're going to be best buds. And maybe I can show him a thing or two. We don't, I think as members of the church, one of our risks is to fail to appreciate how essential the atonement is to bridge that infinite gap between us and God. And that it is an act of grace. It's not an act of sort of natural development, like, yeah, I would have gotten here on my own anyway. and that very much ties into I like your comment. If God doesn't surprise us with what He does, then who is it we're worshiping exactly?
Mm-hmm.
Are we just worshiping our own image of God, or are we worshiping ourselves? So I think that's a wonderful and a very real thing. I think, like I said, I think we as Mormons have to be careful not to succumb to that as well.
I confess to a certain dislike occasionally of church films in which God is depicted in the first vision or something, and it's obviously an actor dressed in a white robe with bright lights shining on him, and I think, okay, I understand what you're doing. I almost wish we didn't do it, though. I wish you maybe just had the outline of a face in brilliantly white light or something. Because I remember Joseph Smith's fear in one of the accounts of the first vision, when he saw that column of light descending upon him, he was terrified that when it hit the trees, they would just burst into flame and explode. I mean, it wasn't just, oh, look, a bright light. It was terrifying. And the first words of angels typically, fear not, which means stop being terrified. It's not, oh, don't get a little upset. It's, you are upset, stop it, calm down. So there is this gulf. It's not the ontological gulf that our mainstream Christian friends talk about, but still there is a vast gulf between where we are and where God is. It's not just a few years of training.
Very true. One of the other things that has always struck me, it's kind of a minor point, but I like it nonetheless, because it shows that we can all worship and accomplish different acts of faith in different ways. Beginning in, where are we here? Alma 31, verse 26. We have Alma seeing how wicked these people are. He's observed the Ramyumptom. He just thinks this is horrible. He realizes how prideful these people are, and he begins to pray. And he prays many things, but he goes through and in verse 32 he asks for comfort, and he asks for success in preaching the gospel, and in verse 33 he asks for strength to bear afflictions. And then you have this fascinating thing that happens in verse 36, and we have the sacrament, and we have temples, and there are all these different ways where we seek the Spirit, but I have yet to see what happens here in verse 36. Now it came to pass that when Alma had said these words, that he clapped his hands upon all them who were with him. And behold, as he clapped his hands upon them, they were filled with the Holy Spirit. Now, I like that, because it's a physical act that is different from anything Joseph Smith would have come up with from his context. And it's a physical act that apparently had some kind of tradition. We doubt he did this out of the blue, and this brings the Holy Spirit. That's great. It's a new tradition, something different than we do, and it invites the Spirit to be there. I've never clapped and sought the Spirit before, because it's not our society. It's not the way that we think. It's not our tradition. But I find this marvelous, because it's something so different from what we would anticipate, and we see it here nonetheless, and it rings true to me. Other comments about chapter 31?
I'll just mention something that I think, especially with members of the church, need to keep in mind, is that whenever there's a finger pointing towards these bad people in the Book of Mormon for all this terrible stuff they've done, there's often a finger pointing right back at us, warning us not to do the same thing. And there was a professor, a friend of mine, who's a professor at BYU, and he said he teaches in the religious education department. And he says when he's teaching the end of 2nd Nephi, he'll go with the students. And he'll be like, okay, students, let's look at what all these apostate Christian churches are supposed to be all about, right? And they'll go through and he says, okay. And after they've done that, then, okay, so yeah, all those churches are bad because they do all these things. He says, have you ever seen this in our church? have you ever, seen this happening in our culture amongst our own people? Let's go through the list. And he goes through and he puts, have you seen people do this or do this or this? And it's, oh, yeah, I've seen that. And so I think, President Uchtdorf warned not too long ago in General Conference. He specifically talked about the Ramyumptom. And he warned us about avoiding our own Ramyumptoms that we sometimes get on in the church. And it's an unfortunate reality that there are those in the church who do get on these holier-than-thou Ramyumptoms, and they have this attitude. And so I think it's remarkably honest and remarkably frank how the Book of Mormon is warning us about these things, right? It's not just that the others are going to do that, it's that we're susceptible to do this as well if we're not careful. And so I think it's cautionary. We need to look at what sorts of attitudes do we have, and is this what the Book of Mormon is warning us against? And so that's something that just sort of stands out to me, right? And I think that may be one of the reasons why Mormon goes into such detail with these chapters. He doesn't want to just pass over. He wants us to give us a really clear picture of behavior you're supposed to avoid. And the best way to do that is to really focus on it. So something I think to think about as we approach chapters, if we ever see apostates or if we ever see people that are preaching bad stuff or evil things, we need to be not just recognize it, but be careful that we recognize it in ourselves and change that if we need to and repent of that.
Yeah, I think the question at the Last Supper when the Savior says that someone there is going to betray him and people say, Lord, is it I? That's a question we should occasionally ask ourselves. Am I the one doing it? Well, I'm sitting here feeling pretty complacent, comfortable. Am I doing it? I love the story of the prophet Nathan who goes to David, who's stolen away the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Tells him this little parable about somebody who stole a lamb from a neighbor, and David is incensed. He's a just king, and then Nathan says, "Behold the man. You're the one. Thou art the man. You did it." And then it hits David. I always mean to look it up, and I always forget to do it. I can't remember if it's Mark Twain or what's his name, Ambrose Bierce, the Devil's Dictionary, who defines Scripture as a book of spiritual guidance admirably suited to the needs of my neighbor. And, the fact is, you ought not to be thinking, yeah, that's so and so, that he does that, and she's just like that. Boy, that's a dead ringer for her. We should be asking ourselves more commonly, boy, do I do this? Am I guilty of this in any way? That's what it's for. It's not designed to, again, this is about the Zoramites. It's not about giving you license to look down on others. It's to afflict the comfortable and to comfort the afflicted. But if you're feeling too comfortable, you probably need to get something right between the eyes. Doesn't hurt every once in a while to have that happen.
It's also worth remembering we have sort of a spiritual high watermark at the end of Mosiah, where you've got the people of King Limhi and Alma's people all coming together, and you've got the reign of the judges and the establishment of the Church of God, and so on and so forth. And it's worth keeping in mind that the narrative arc we're going to see, starting with Alma 1 through to 3 Nephi 8, is going to be an ongoing breakdown of both society and church. That you're going to you see these schisms, you see these groups, and so on. We're going to see the wars that result not because the Lamanites suddenly decided they hate the Nephites, but mostly because Nephite dissenters went over to the Lamanites and started the big propaganda effort, and speakers on towers talking about how awful the Nephites were and drumming up stuff for war. And it's sort of a cycle, but it keeps going downward until what we'll finally see, and when you get to around 3 Nephi 6 or 7, is you see the whole breakdown of the government at all. Everything goes to tribes, and there's sort of a detente going on for the most part, and that's the lead into the destruction at the time of the death of Christ. I very much agree with the comments that these are warnings to us, specifically as members of the church. I think this is why this is in the Book of Mormon, to not succumb to the various types and ways of disbelief that are shown here. You've got this, we're the chosen people. We're the ones saved. Everyone else is being thrust down to hell. I think there are times that you can probably see with all that we rightly proclaim about the kingdom of God on earth, there is a risk of us becoming likewise satisfied in having the church be the only true church. It is. It's Christ's church. He's at the head. His priesthood is here. We have the ordinances of salvation. No one does. That should be a cause for humility and extra effort to bless the lives of others, not self-satisfaction, which is what you have happening with the Zoramites.
Great comments. Any other final comments about chapter 31?
I don't think so.
We'll call that good then. Thank you very much, Bruce Webster, Dan Peterson, and Stephen Smoot for joining us on our roundtable. And for those of you who are watching, we hope you'll join us for other roundtables in the future, and also spend some time on the Interpreter website, because there are other very wonderful things there as well. Great deal of fabulous papers and other works. Thanks for joining us today.